I'm Ryan Balmer and this is Berlin Re-Guided. Today we'll be covering one of the most iconic sites in the German capital. You'll find it on our coins, you'll see it on our trains, but what is it about the Brandenburg Gate that earned it such a special place in the city's affections? Today's story begins at the very end of the 18th century, or 1786 to be precise. After 46 years on the throne, Frederick the Great, the most impactful of all the Prussian kings, has passed away. Now he's died childless, and his nephew, Frederick William II, now has some pretty big shoes to fill. Unfortunately, he doesn't even come close. Some of the Prussian kings that came before him had impressive names bestowed upon them, such as the Great or the Great Elector or the Soldier King. Frederick William II gained something of a reputation as a womanizer, as being incredibly lazy, and also being a little bit on the heavy side. So the people of Prussia began to name him Der Dicke Luderjan, which roughly translates as something like the chubby scoundrel, or at least that's what we'll be calling him today. Whilst I personally find it quite amusing to imagine the Prussian king back then, the chubby scoundrel, sitting around his palace consuming entire roasted swans, only to drag himself out of his chair intermittently to chase a baroness around his palace, he did actually get some stuff done during his time as king. Case in point, it's the chubby scoundrel who's responsible for the Brandenburg Gate. At the end of the 18th century, when the Brandenburg Gate was first constructed, Berlin was still something of a small provincial capital. The western boundary of the city could be found exactly where the gate stands today. So it was simply a gate. It was a way into Berlin. It was a way out of Berlin. It marked the start of a road which ran all the way to a little town called Brandenburg an der Havel, which is where we derive the name of the gate itself. But it's what's happened to the gate, or through the gates, or at the gate over the years that have enshrined its legendary status. After the death of Frederick the Great in 1786, there are two Prussian kings who somewhat take their foot off the gas when it comes to maintaining that enormous Prussian military machine. What this ensures is that in 1806, when Napoleon and the French army come along, they don't exactly struggle to roll right over the top of the Prussian army. Shortly afterwards, Napoleon will ride triumphantly right through the Brandenburg Gate, becoming the first, but certainly not the last, to do so. Ever since then, every conqueror or liberator or dictator or Führer or president who wants to make a mark in Berlin will use the Brandenburg Gate in exactly that same fashion. For all of these eras in Berlin's history, this is where it all begins, and it's often where it all ends. In 1945, after Nazi Germany surrendered, Berlin and Germany were divided into 4 zones of occupation. In Berlin, they used existing political boundaries, district lines, neighbourhood boundaries. Much of the historical centre of the city, the neighbourhood known as Mitte, which includes the Brandenburg Gate, ended up on the Soviet side of the line. What this means is that a British-controlled section of Berlin, known as the Tiergarten, could be found just on the other side of the gate. Within 4 years of the end of the war, the relationship between the 3 Western powers and the Soviet Union had broken down to such a degree that 2 separate German states were formed. The French, British and American occupation zones now formed the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, a democracy that had an economy run along free market capitalist lines. The Soviet occupation zone was now known as East Germany or the German Democratic Republic. Despite the name, it was far from a democracy. East Germany would lose around 1/6 of its population to West Germany between 1949 and 1961. Initially, East German people simply fled across the enormous border between the two countries. But once that is heavily fortified by the East German government, West Berlin starts to become by far the easiest escape route for East German people to West Germany. In 1961, in August of that year, the East German government decide to seal off West Berlin, and they do so, of course, by building the Berlin Wall. You could see in the road a line of bricks that mark out where the Berlin Wall used to stand, curving all the way past the gate and following the route of the Tiergarten Park in central Berlin. The Brandenburg Gate was now sealed off to the people of West Berlin. The Hotel Adlon, one of Berlin's most exclusive hotels these days, as well as before the Nazi period, could be found on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you might just be able to make out, somewhat tragically, a Starbucks. Think of a fence running between these two locations, and that's about as close as an East German civilian could have got to the Brandenburg Gate for almost 3 decades. The area immediately on the east side of the Berlin Wall is often erroneously referred to as no man's land. I don't use that term because there were men in that land, but they were East German guards, and their job was to stop East German people getting anywhere near the Berlin Wall in the first place. And they were aided in that task with fences and barbed wire and dogs and trenches and watchtowers. This is why it becomes unofficially termed the death strip. People tend not to die at the wall or on the wall. They die trying to get anywhere near the wall in the first place. And the Brandenburg Gate was found right in the centre of that strip. This entire area was off limits to East German civilians, which means they were able to see the gate, but they could not access it, and they certainly couldn't walk through it. Ultimately, the experience that East and West Berliners have of the gate between 1961 and 1989, when the Berlin Wall is still standing, is one of the only shared experiences they have. Visible to both, accessible to neither. And because of that status, the Brandenburg Gate becomes a symbol of division for decades, perhaps the symbol of the divided Berlin. What this means is, in 1989, in November of that year, when the checkpoints of the Berlin Wall start to be opened up all around the city, it's at the Brandenburg Gate that the biggest celebrations start to take place. The simple act of walking through this gate, of celebrating around the gate together, is what begins to symbolically reunify the two peoples of Berlin and the two halves of the city.